Celeste is when gameplay design, narrative structure, and a dynamic soundtrack seamlessly blend together to create one of the best indie games I've ever played. In a sea of quality 2D platformers, each with their own unique twists, it's worth exploring what exactly Celeste does so well to make it stand out among the crowd. So today I'm going to answer the following questions. What is Celeste? Would you enjoy it? And what about the game makes it so memorable? My name is Resonance22, and in this retrospective, I'll be taking a look at the game design behind Celeste. I'll briefly start with the presentation. The pixel art is extremely charming, the animations are detailed, and most importantly, everything is easily readable. You control a single character named Madeline, and lead her on her journey to climb to the top of Celeste Mountain. The mountain serves as both a colossal physical obstacle to overcome, as well as a greater metaphor for overcoming her own internal doubts. The narrative and gameplay work in tandem here, and it's quite impressive. I'll keep this retrospective completely spoiler-free, so that way you can still enjoy the surprises yourself. Celeste is a 2D platformer, where players can run, jump, dash, and climb walls. Each tool is used to navigate through a series of handcrafted levels with frequent checkpoints, and to solve a variety of interesting puzzles. These abilities are all quite simple on the surface, but tight controls and endlessly clever level design really push them to their fullest. Movement in Celeste feels incredibly responsive and satisfying across even the toughest levels. Madeline's main ability is her dash, which she can use only once until she lands on a solid platform, even if just for a moment. You'll know that her dash is exhausted when her hair is blue. As we saw in the previous clips, passing through certain types of blocks, bubbles, and bouncing off of spring platforms will all refresh her dash as well. Madeline can also climb walls, but has limited stamina before she eventually slips, so players always have to be constantly on the lookout for platforms or ledges that Madeline can rest on to recover her dash and take a moment to breathe. You'll see me carefully plan my routes, test new ones, quickly learn new ways to approach a situation, and I always get so much satisfaction out of navigating through these areas. The simplicity in Celeste's premise and controls are perhaps one of its bigger strengths. Since Celeste's mechanics are so straightforward, it barely needs an introduction, and can avoid having a drawn-out tutorial. Players can jump right into the action immediately, and that is what is expected from the first screen. Like with Cave Story, Celeste teaches players through experience, and saves its text boxes purely for exposition. Celeste communicates so much without telling the player anything more than just its controls. It's the carefully placed obstacles that do the rest. In the first screen, the game opens up with a simple transition just to draw the player's attention toward Madeline. Then it's up to you to jump across some short platforms of varying heights. Figuring out your basic jump controls is quick and requires no explanation. They also show you that you can climb walls. On the third platform, however, a large frozen rock will fall from the ceiling after a brief delay, and plenty of shaking to warn the player. Since the block of ice in the ceiling only begins to fall as you leave the platform that it's going to land on, it's unlikely that you'll be crushed by it. The other obstacles on this screen are the numerous bottomless pits, but each of those are short, simple jumps that give the player ample space to work with. The reason that these easy traps exist at all are just the designers trying to let the player know that the mountain is dangerous, without immediately punishing them. Bottomless pits and large falling rocks are all symbols that players automatically assume will be lethal. Clever designers utilize symbols like these for a smoother learning curve. While personally I'm one of those players that deliberately stands in fires to test for fire damage, I think that most people will know that Madeline will not appreciate being turned into a pancake. None of the obstacles here can kill you in practice, and they all serve as set pieces to increase anticipation for an upcoming segment. Near the end of the prologue, we reach a long stone bridge. While crossing it, the bridge begins to collapse, and Madeline must quickly run to the end before she'll fall. Immediately the soundtrack shifts from an ambient piano melody to an exciting build-up, which signals that it's time to run. The song change isn't something ominous, it's actually still an uplifting tune, but with more urgency, motivating the players to keep trying. It's on this screen that you may fall for the first time, as you practice your timed jumps. Once you make it to the end, Madeline will always slip at the last moment, but it feels very natural and not forced. However, this time the game will pause for a moment and introduce the dash mechanic. Madeline can dash once, whether in midair or on the ground, before she must briefly rest by standing on a solid platform. Since the game shows you this while you're about to fall, it quickly teaches players a valuable use case, which is that a carefully timed midair dash can often save you and assist with longer jumps. This is an elegant tutorial segment, since it teaches so much while saying so little, allowing players to learn the basics mostly through experience. Celeste is a truly challenging game, and it pushes you just a bit from even the short prologue. The 3 lines of exposition just before it echo that sentiment. Her internal dialogue reads, "This is it, Madeline. Just breathe. Why are you so nervous?" It reminds the player that climbing this mountain is a big deal, not just for Madeline, but also for yourself. You're bound to be nervous, but remember, you can do this. The game structure serves many purposes, but the first one is communicating that this game is going to be hard, and yet you will be able to get through it. To me, Celeste's most impressive design element is how it manages to defeat me over and over while never getting frustrating. I'll explore those systems throughout this retrospective, much like I did with Crypt the NecroDancer. If you slip off the bridge segment or wherever your first death is, you'll notice that you respawn immediately at the start of the screen. Since every massive level is divided into countless short segments, almost no progress is ever lost. In addition, there are no pointless lives, no mocking game over screens, and no waiting for platforms or levels to reset. You can jump straight back into the action without any delay. I really admire this design philosophy, as it allows for consistently challenging gameplay to actually be more approachable by a wider audience. No delays and frequent checkpoints give players the opportunity to learn by experience, and through many attempts, you will make steady progress. Celeste is not just for hardcore players craving a challenge, it's actually designed for everyone, and I was surprised to see it done so well here. In addition, when you die, the music doesn't stop or reset, it just continues as normal, as if nothing happened. This, along with immediate respawns, helps keep players in a flow state and determined to keep trying. There's no immersion breaking, and I can't praise it enough for these systems. The whole point is that failure is not a big deal, and it's not even a failure at all. Every death is a learning experience. You're going to die a lot in Celeste, and in my first playthrough, hundreds of times per level, and thousands of times over the course of the game. However, since the game doesn't punish you for falling, players are encouraged to keep experimenting and give it another round. I absolutely adore how Celeste doesn't make you feel bad for failing to surpass an intentionally difficult challenge. For me personally, negative reinforcement is not a great motivator for me to want to finish something. When I look back at the games that made me put the controller down, it's always because I got really far in a segment with no checkpoints, made a simple mistake, and the immersion-breaking game over screen and frustration over so much lost progress were enough to make me want to take a break. Celeste impresses me for many reasons, but I think the most broadly applicable one is how it kept me consistently engaged and optimistic. Things like the music continuing as normal, quick respawn times, and the level design allowing you to jump immediately back into the action helped me remain constantly motivated to continue. The only times that I stopped playing Celeste were because I realized that it was 3 AM and that I needed to get some sleep, or I had something I needed to do. Now, this is particularly interesting to me because the primary games that I binge play to completion are usually Pokemon, Ace Attorney, or Kirby games. There's also Breath of the Wild, Skyrim, and a host of individual cases, but really these days, I guess because I'm busier and have more obligations, it's not as easy for games to hook me like they once did when I was a kid. Celeste is remarkably fun, and part of the reason is that it never mocks you for your mistakes. Another aspect of Celeste that I find impressive is how intuitive the level design is. At no point during my first playthrough did I ever feel truly lost. I either knew what I needed to do, or I was making progress toward figuring it out. The only 2 times that I was stuck for a brief moment was during the 1st and 5th chapters, and that's only because it took me a bit to figure out how platform momentum works. The game does a great job teaching this, and gives you many opportunities to experience and learn it before you actually have to use it. What I mean is that when you're riding a fast-moving platform, like these stoplights or those stone platforms in Chapter 5, if you jump right as you're nearing the end of the rail, then it will launch you significantly further. Whenever Celeste introduces a new mechanic, it gives you ample time to be exposed to it in its simplest form, before things get progressively more complicated. In a game with simple mechanics, sometimes the best way to learn is through experience, and the excellent level design does exactly that. Let's take a look at a clip from my first playthrough to give a specific example of how Celeste teaches players. In the Golden Heights level, which is a much needed break from the heavier tones of the previous chapters, you're introduced to several new mechanics. These include, but aren't limited to, harsh winds which push the player, and these floating bubbles, which launch the player in the direction of the input just before being expelled. You can see me struggle at first with how the wind affects my platforming and movement, but I figure it out pretty quickly. The bubbles are quite fun to play with, and I also get a feel for what they're capable of, notably that they can break cracked rocks. Then I come across a collectible strawberry surrounded by spikes, and is too far for the bubble to launch me into. Placing the strawberry here signals to the player that they should try dashing after being launched out of the bubble. While I do miss it the first few times, I'm still able to grab onto this pillar that I didn't break yet, which is excellent level design. After a few more tries, I'm able to get the strawberry, and I feel so much more confident with this level's many mechanics. I'll explain these optional collectibles in a later section. Celeste is also a game that just feels really good to play, both physically due to the smooth controls and mechanics, as well as mentally due to the relatable characters, premise, and message of the central narrative. It's often difficult to describe what I deal with internally, and I think that Celeste does a better job explaining my anxiety than I could. It's pretty remarkable in that while the plot is relatable, it never comes off as preachy or forced. The narrative fits perfectly with both the soundtrack and gameplay, something that makes Celeste very special. There is perhaps no better example of this than with Chapter 6, and if you've played the game, then you know what I'm talking about. I still get goosebumps thinking about that segment, and I would show it here, but I'd rather new players experience it for themselves. Another breathtaking example is represented in the tonal, gameplay, and soundtrack shift between Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. Chapter 1 carries a rather cheery motif, one intended to communicate warmth and optimism to the player while they learn the ropes of a truly challenging game. Like all songs in the game, it's an excellent tune to platform to. Chapter 2 is where the game plays with your expectations a bit, and it was there that I was immediately sold on Celeste. The soundtrack takes on a darker, more mysterious tone, and the environment becomes almost surreal. The soundtrack is just so beautiful here, as it provides an eerie, ambient melody that is also almost welcoming, encouraging the player to explore even though you're not quite sure what's going on. Without spoiling any of the narrative, something happens in Chapter 2, causing both the soundtrack to evolve into a trance-like wondrous melody, and the level itself to transform into something else entirely. As you'd rightfully assume from looking at the level, of course at some point Madeline would probably gain the ability to pass through these obviously strange space blocks. That even triggers the music change, and it's one of many examples where Celeste seamlessly weaves its soundtrack, gameplay, and narrative together. The evolving soundtrack as you get through the levels helps communicate an added sense of progress, tension, wonder, and elevate Celeste from a great game to one of the most memorable indie titles I've ever played. Besides the first chapter, every level contains several expanding remixes of that level's song, which change as you progress further. Since players may get stuck on a segment for quite some time, it's nice to have a good beat to platform to, and a dynamic soundtrack that rewards progression. Another example is how the soundtrack becomes muffled once you're under the water. Some of you may be alarmed to hear that, but don't worry, this platformer gets bonus points for having very few segments with water, using it for mostly aesthetic reasons, and also having no dedicated water levels. The fantastic music of Jolly Roger Bay unfortunately can't save the generally boring nature of stifled movement in water, although I have to admit that Mario 64 does it better than most, and some games can do this well. Celeste though sticks to what it knows best, consistent platforming and climbing mechanics. I also find it remarkable how Celeste is able to avoid becoming repetitive, despite its deceptively simple mechanics. One way it does this is by having a dynamic soundtrack. The other way that Celeste achieves variety is through the very careful trickle of new obstacles in each chapter, that utilize your simple movement options in consistently interesting ways. Once these obstacles are introduced, they are then combined to form complex platform and puzzle layouts so that no two rooms ever quite feel the same. These new interactable objects are spaced out well enough that there feels like no missed opportunities to test out their applications, while also never feeling overwhelming for players. If a game is constantly throwing new mechanics at you, they might never get an opportunity to shine like they do in Celeste, and players may not have enough time to master them either. Like with any great game, everything that you've learned is tested through its memorable boss fights and the final chapter. If you're interested, I plan to upload a full playthrough of Chapter 6 on my channel, and you can find a link to it in the video description below, at the end of this video, or just by subscribing. During your journey, you'll come across a few types of collectible items hidden throughout the levels. The most common item is the strawberry, and they are cleverly placed in difficult to reach locations, requiring some extra precise platforming and puzzle solving. Some strawberries are brutal to get, and some are only a short detour. Which strawberries are seemingly impossible for you and which are easier to reach all depend on your individual mastery of specific level micro-mechanics. During your first playthrough, I wouldn't worry too much about the amount of strawberries you choose to collect, as the game emphasizes that they don't actually unlock anything and are only for bragging rights. What makes these berries particularly great design is that they remain consistent with the narrative and gameplay. Celeste is a challenging game that respects your time and lets you choose your experience. Another collectible that you might encounter are these elusive B-side tapes. These are hidden more carefully with only one per chapter, and are often accompanied by deviously timed platforming puzzles, which have the nice quirk of being synced to the beat of the music. These become increasingly more difficult the further you are along in the story, so don't be discouraged if you can't grab these on your first playthrough, because again, you can always come back for them. After completing the main story, you can replay levels from several well-spaced checkpoints, which is a fantastic feature. I should also mention that there are winged strawberries that will fly away if you use your dash, encouraging alternate ways to play through a section. Once you collect a B-side tape, you may be tempted to play the B-side before the next story chapter, and I'd strongly caution you against that. The B-sides are all ludicrously challenging and a huge step up in difficulty from everything in the main 7-chapter story. These should be considered post-game content for veterans or masochists. The B-sides are interesting. They each test your mastery, and I mean mastery, of that specific chapter's mechanics, all in very clever ways. As I said though, the difficulty in these is immense. I would describe them as being barely not too overwhelming that I still want to try them, but some of the segments are so demanding of the player that I almost didn't want to finish them. While I never actually quit a B-side, and I did proudly finish most of them, the experience is certainly not for everyone. Apparently there are also C-side missions, golden strawberries, and plenty of challenges far tougher than the B-sides, for players who have truly mastered Celeste gameplay. Looking back on my early footage, I wish I had recorded my first playthrough of Chapter 1, because I'm so proud of how much I've improved. The game keeps track of this with a death counter, which in most games would come off the wrong way, but here it's a measure of progress for each subsequent playthrough. I enjoyed the main campaign so much that I played through it 3 more times, and I'm sure I'll do it again. I went from dying hundreds of times per chapter to as low as 20 to 50, and we'll see how much more I can progress. I also never thought I'd be able to finish the B-side for Chapter 2, and I can't even begin to describe how satisfying that was. There were so many tough segments in there that at first seemed like I'd never get past. The parts where you're being chased are seriously intense. Thankfully though, you'll notice that throughout Celeste, the most difficult segments are typically followed by a slightly more relaxing part, to allow the player to finally exhale. This is excellent game design, and one of many reasons why I'm always inspired to finish my play session. On a related note, Celeste has made me appreciate just how durable the Pro Controller is, since I was gripping it so tightly that I'm surprised it still works. Now, in regards to level design, you think that the short length of segments would be restrictive on Celeste's creativity. However, later in the game, they do introduce mid-segment checkpoints, which allow the game to communicate scale when it needs to. I won't show exactly how this is represented to avoid spoilers, but needless to say, it feels incredibly satisfying and intuitive. Every time I walked away from a play session, I felt really good about myself, and proud that I was able to make significant progress in what is objectively a difficult game. Every step further feels super rewarding. By the end of the game, I came away with a lasting sense of optimism. I'm really glad that I started this retrospective series, because it's led me to revisit my favorite old titles, such as Cave Story and Crypt of the NecroDancer, and also discover new ones like Celeste. I don't toss around 9s or 10s lightly, since it dilutes the arbitrary value of an equally arbitrary rating system. So instead, I'll end with this. Celeste truly succeeds at what it's trying to be, and it deserves my highest possible recommendation. While I've said that about quite a few games recently, it's important to remember just how many great games that there are hiding in the endless sea of your game's to-do list. I'm quite happy that I picked Celeste this time, as it's a game that I think everyone should know about. I'd love to see more games in a similar vein too, where respawns are immediate, checkpoints are frequent, mechanics are demanding, smooth, easy to pick up, and difficult to master. Celeste carries all of those attributes, while also seamlessly weaving an exceptional sound design and narrative into this masterpiece of gameplay. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Did you enjoy this overview/retrospective? Are there any games that you've played recently that have such a rewarding difficulty curve without feeling frustrating? I'd also be curious if anyone is interested in more reviews, retrospectives, and game design discussion videos. If you enjoyed watching this video, then feel free to subscribe for more content in a similar style, and I have some other indie game recommendations at the end and in the video description below. As always, thank you so much for the support, especially on Patreon, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next video. Thanks for watching.